Your Honor, my father is Richard Sterling. His lawyers can settle this by tomorrow morning. This whole thing is a waste of everyone's time.
I stepped into my courtroom that morning with a stack of cases that usually blur together, but this one had a stench of entitlement before the doors even swung open. The bailiff called the case, and in strolled Marcus Sterling. He was 20-something, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my bailiff makes in a year, and a smirk that screamed he had never been told no in his entire privileged life. He walked into my courtroom like he didn't belong there, like this was all a tedious, minor inconvenience that his lawyers would clean up before lunch. He believed his powerful last name would protect him. He believed money would carry him out the same door he walked in. He was dead wrong. I took my seat, adjusted my glasses, and stared him down. "State your name for the record," I demanded, my voice cutting through the smug aura he dragged in with him. "Marcus Sterling," he replied, leaning casually against the podium, as if he were ordering a martini at a country club. He even had the audacity to check his heavy gold Rolex while I was speaking. Marcus was the defendant. He was being sued by an elderly veteran named Arthur, who stood quietly at the plaintiff's podium. Arthur's hands were rough and calloused from decades of hard, honest work. He was clutching a worn folder filled with unpaid invoices and repair estimates. According to the complaint, Marcus had hired Arthur's small landscaping business for a massive project at his new estate. Marcus had demanded impossible, last-minute changes, verbally abused Arthur and his crew, and then when Arthur politely asked for a partial payment to cover materials, Marcus purposely drove his sports car through Arthur's newly planted garden, destroying thousands of dollars worth of equipment out of pure spite. The damages were over $9,000. To Marcus, that was pocket change. To Arthur, it was his livelihood. "Mr. Sterling," I said, leaning forward, my eyes locked onto his, "you are accused of destroying this man's property, humiliating him, and refusing to pay for services rendered. What exactly makes you think you can treat people, especially a hardworking veteran, like your personal punching bag?" Marcus sighed, an exaggerated, dramatic sound that instantly made my blood boil. "Your Honor, this is a massive misunderstanding. The work was completely subpar. I simply refused to pay for garbage. And the so-called accident with my car was exactly that, a minor accident. My father's attorneys have already offered him a nuisance fee to make this go away, but this man insisted on wasting the court's time. He invoked his father's name like it was a magic spell. My father's attorneys. He threw it out there, fully expecting me to cower. He thought that name drop would intimidate everyone in the room. What he didn't know was that his arrogant little show was about to crash and burn, and what happened next would shock the entire courtroom to its core. I turned my attention away from the smirking boy in the designer suit and looked at the plaintiff. "Arthur," I said, intentionally softening my voice, just a fraction, "tell me exactly what happened. And please, take your time. Nobody is going to rush you in my courtroom." Arthur cleared his throat, his posture rigid with the kind of discipline you only learn in the military. "Your Honor, my crew and I spent 3 weeks completely overhauling the landscaping at Mr. Sterling's property. We worked 12-hour days in the blistering heat. We followed every design specification to the letter. But on the final day, when I presented the invoice for the remaining balance, Mr. Sterling flew into a rage." "A rage over what?" I asked, leaning back. "He said the color of the mulch was depressing and demanded we rip everything out and start over for free," Arthur explained, his calloused hands gripping his paperwork. "When I told him we couldn't do that without being compensated for the extra labor and materials, he started screaming. He called me incompetent. He told me I was just the help. Then he got into his sports car, laughed, and deliberately reversed over our staging area. He crushed my commercial mowers, my trimmers, and ripped up a section of the lawn we had just laid down." Marcus let out a loud theatrical scoff. "Oh, please, it was a blind spot. I didn't see his rusty old junk piled up in my driveway." I slammed my hand flat on the bench. The sharp crack echoed through the room. "Quiet. You don't speak unless I address you, Mr. Sterling. Do you understand me?" He rolled his eyes, a petulant child trapped in a grown man's body, but snapped his mouth shut. I looked back at Arthur. "Do you have proof of this so-called blind spot accident?" Arthur nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Honor. The neighbor's security camera caught the whole thing. I have the footage right here." "Bailiff, let's see the video," I ordered. The screen in the courtroom flickered to life. The footage was crystal clear. It showed Marcus storming out of his massive front doors, waving his arms and shouting. It showed him getting into a sleek silver sports car. But he didn't just back out. He put the car in reverse, cranked the steering wheel, and intentionally accelerated directly into Arthur's expensive equipment. You could literally see him pausing, looking out the window to check his aim, and then gunning the engine. The courtroom gasped. The sound of crunching metal was audible even on the security feed. And the worst part? As he pulled away, the camera caught Marcus sticking his hand out the window, flipping Arthur off. I paused the video and glared down at the defendant, letting the silence stretch until it was suffocating. A blind spot, Mr. Sterling? Really? You looked right at it. You aimed for it. Marcus shifted on his feet. The smirk wavered for a fraction of a second, but his blinding entitlement quickly covered it up. Well, if his junk wasn't on my property, besides, I can write a check for that garbage right now. It's not a big deal. My father will cover it. My blood ran cold. Not a big deal? I whispered, my voice dangerously low. He had no idea the storm he was about to unleash. Not a big deal, I repeated, my voice dropping an octave, carrying that razor-sharp edge that usually makes grown men sweat. You intentionally destroyed the livelihood of a hardworking veteran because he wouldn't bow down to your temper tantrum, and you think you can just wave a checkbook to make it disappear? Marcus actually rolled his eyes again, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke jacket. Your Honor, with all due respect, my father is Richard Sterling. You probably know him. He practically owns half the commercial real estate in this city. I'm sure we can just settle this right now without all this dramatic lecturing. I have a flight to Aspen in 3 hours. The absolute audacity of this boy was staggering. He wasn't just blind to his own horrific behavior, he was actively proud of it. He genuinely believed that the rules of human decency didn't apply to him because his last name was Sterling. He wore his privilege like a shield, fully expecting the entire world to bend the knee. I leaned forward, clasping my hands tightly on the bench. Let me explain something to you, Mr. Sterling, in words small enough for you to comprehend. In my courtroom, I don't care if your father is the King of England or the man who cleans the streets. Your money means absolutely nothing here. Your entitlement is a disease, and your behavior is a disgrace. Marcus scoffed, crossing his arms and leaning back. My father's lawyers will have this entire judgment thrown out by tomorrow morning. You're wasting your breath. This whole process is a joke. The only joke I see is standing right in front of me. I snapped back, my gavel hand itching. I was about to hit him with the maximum judgment allowable by law, plus heavy sanctions for his blatantly contemptuous behavior, when the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. It wasn't the bailiff. It wasn't a witness. The courtroom fell completely silent as a tall, distinguished man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit walked down the center aisle. He had iron gray hair, a stern jaw, and a quiet, heavy presence that instantly commanded the room. Marcus turned around, his smug expression morphing into one of absolute triumph. "Dad," he said, a bratty, victorious grin spreading across his face as he looked back at me. "Perfect timing. Tell this judge to wrap this up so we can leave." But Richard Sterling didn't smile at his son. He didn't even acknowledge him. He walked straight past Marcus, stopped squarely at the swinging gate, and looked directly up at me. His expression was like carved granite, and the energy in the room shifted so violently you could practically feel the air pressure drop. Richard Sterling stood before my bench. The man exuded authority, not the cheap, loud kind his son flaunted, but a quiet, dangerous kind of power forged by decades of actual hard work. Marcus, still leaning against his podium, let out a victorious laugh. "See, Your Honor? I told you. My dad's here to handle this. Let's just cut the check and get out of this dump." I didn't take my eyes off Richard. In my 40 years on the bench, I've seen every kind of wealthy parent rush in to sweep their spoiled children's messes under the rug. I braced myself for the usual arrogant speech about how their family time was too valuable for my court. But Richard didn't pull out a checkbook. He didn't signal to a team of lawyers. Instead, he looked at me with an expression of profound exhaustion. "Your Honor," Richard said, his voice deep and remarkably steady, "my name is Richard Sterling. I am this boy's father, and I would like to request permission to speak on the record." I narrowed my eyes, assessing him. "This isn't a family meeting, Mr. Sterling. This is a court of law. Unless you are testifying as a witness, you have no standing here." "I understand," Richard replied, bowing his head slightly, in a show of genuine respect that his son completely lacked. "But I am the legal owner of the vehicle he used to commit this crime. And I am the one who funded the bank account he just tried to use to buy his way out of your courtroom." I raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Richard turned slowly to face his son. Marcus's smug smile began to falter, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. Dad? What are you doing? Just tell her to dismiss it. Shut your mouth, Marcus, Richard snapped, the sharpness of his tone echoing off the wood-paneled walls. The entire courtroom flinched. Marcus looked like he had just been physically struck. Richard stepped closer to the defendant's podium, his eyes blazing with a mix of fury and deep disappointment. I got a call from our legal team an hour ago. They told me you were down here, demanding a settlement for a minor traffic incident. But they also sent me the security footage. Richard pointed a trembling finger at the blank screen where the video had just played. You didn't have a blind spot. You threw a tantrum because a working man demanded to be paid for his labor. You used my car as a weapon to destroy his livelihood. Marcus stammered, the color completely draining from his face. Dad, he was being unreasonable. He disrespected me. You know how these people are. These people? Richard's voice thundered, dropping the quiet demeanor entirely. You don't even know what respect is. You think my money is a shield you can hide behind every time you act like a monster. You thought my name made you untouchable. The courtroom was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Privilege was collapsing right in front of our eyes, and nobody dared to breathe. Richard took a deep, shuddering breath, visibly trying to rein in his temper. He turned his back on his sputtering son and looked up at me. The anger in his eyes was replaced by a profound, heavy shame. It was the look of a parent realizing their biggest failure was standing right next to them. Your Honor, Richard said, his voice carrying clearly across the utterly silent room. For 25 years, I have given this boy everything. I gave him the best education money could buy, a trust fund, a secure position in my company. I thought I was giving him a strong foundation. I was wrong. I gave him a weapon, and he has used it to abuse honest, hardworking people. Marcus grabbed his father's sleeve, genuine panic finally shattering his smug facade. Dad, please, are you crazy? You can't do this to me. I'm your son. We have a flight to Aspen. Richard yanked his arm away as if he had been burned by the contact. There is no flight to Aspen, Marcus. I canceled your ticket. I froze your bank accounts on the car ride over here. And those corporate attorneys you keep threatening to unleash on everyone? I ordered them to stand down. You are entirely on your own. The collective intake of breath in the gallery was deafening. Marcus staggered back, clutching the edge of the podium like he was going to collapse. The armor of his privilege was being stripped away piece by piece, not by the legal system, but by the very man who had built it. I looked at Arthur, the elderly veteran standing at the plaintiff's table. Even he looked shocked, his calloused hands resting gently on his folder of invoices. Mr. Sterling, I said, keeping my voice steady and commanding, though inside I was absolutely floored. In my 4 decades on the bench, I had never witnessed a powerful parent dismantle their child's entitlement with such surgical, ruthless precision. What exactly are you asking of this court today? Richard stood tall, squaring his shoulders, facing me with absolute resolve. I am asking you, Your Honor, to show him absolutely no leniency. Do not let him hide behind my name or my wealth. He caused this destruction. He must bear the weight of it alone. I will personally reimburse Arthur for every single penny of his destroyed equipment before we leave this building, because this honorable man deserves immediate restitution and a genuine apology. But as for the judgment against Marcus, I want it on his public record. I want him held fully accountable for his actions, just like any other citizen who stands before your bench. Marcus was trembling violently now, looking like a terrified little boy. The bespoke designer suit suddenly looked 3 sizes too big for him. Dad, please, you're ruining my life. No, Marcus, Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion but unwavering in its conviction. I am trying to save your character, because right now, you don't have one. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I looked from the trembling boy in the designer suit, who was now gripping the podium as if it were a life raft, to the stoic father who had just torn his false world apart. It was without a doubt the most profound display of tough love and moral accountability I had ever witnessed in my 4 decades on the bench. I turned my attention to the plaintiff. Arthur, I said, my voice softening to a tone of deep respect. Mr. Sterling Sr. has stated on the record that he will personally compensate you today for the damages to your equipment and your lost wages. Does this satisfy the financial portion of your claim? Arthur stood tall, though his eyes were slightly glassy. He looked directly at Richard, man to man, veteran to businessman. Yes, Your Honor, Arthur said quietly. And, thank you, Mr. Sterling. I didn't want to drag your family into a courtroom. I just wanted what was fair. Richard nodded slowly, placing a hand over his heart. The apology is entirely mine, Arthur. You served our country, and you served my family with honest, back-breaking work. You deserved far better than what you received on my property. I picked up my pen. It was time to finish this. I turned my eyes back to Marcus, and whatever warmth had been in my voice vanished instantly. I leaned all the way forward, peering over the top of my glasses, letting him feel the full weight of the moment. Marcus, I began, each word dropping like an anvil. You walked through those doors today convinced that you were untouchable. You thought you were inherently better than everyone else in this room because of a bank account you didn't earn and a last name you clearly do not respect. You viewed this hardworking veteran as the help, someone beneath you, someone you could crush just because you were having a bad day. Marcus was actively crying now. The arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by the panicked, shallow breathing of a spoiled child who finally realized the safety net had been cut. Your Honor, please, he whimpered, his voice cracking. A public judgment for malicious destruction. It will ruin my background checks. It will ruin my future. Please, just let my dad pay it and dismiss the case. I didn't even blink. Your behavior ruined your future, Mr. Sterling. You destroyed an innocent man's property out of pure, unadulterated malice. You laughed and flipped him off while driving away. Did you think about your background check then? No. You thought you were invincible. Well, welcome to the real world. In the real world, your actions have permanent consequences. I raised my gavel high. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff for the maximum allowable amount. And exactly as your father requested, this will be a public judgment recorded solely against you, Marcus Sterling. Not your family's trust fund, not an LLC. You. I watched as Richard Sterling stepped over to the plaintiff's table. He didn't just hand Arthur a check. He stood there, looked the veteran in the eye, and shook his hand with a level of respect that made the room feel small. This covers the equipment, your lost time, and a significant surplus for the stress my family has caused you, Richard said, his voice thick but clear. It's the least I can do for a man of your character. Arthur accepted the check with a steady hand. He didn't gloat. He didn't look at Marcus with pity. He simply nodded. The dignity of a life spent in service, shining far brighter than any diamond on Marcus's wrist. Then, the moment that truly shocked the entire courtroom happened. Marcus, seeing the check being handed over, seemed to have a momentary lapse in reality. He wiped his eyes with his silk pocket square and started to stand up, smoothing his jacket. Okay, he muttered, his voice still shaky. It's paid, let's go, Dad, I'm starving and we've already missed the first flight. Maybe we can take the private jet instead. The silence that followed was chilling. Richard Sterling turned slowly to look at his son. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked at Marcus as if he were a stranger or worse, a ghost. I told you, Marcus, Richard said, his voice as cold as a mountain stream. There is no flight. There is no we. You aren't coming back to the estate. You aren't going back to your office. I've already had the locks changed on your apartment, the apartment I pay for. Marcus froze, his mouth hanging open. What? Dad, you can't be serious. Where am I supposed to go? You have the suit on your back and the watch on your wrist, Richard replied. Sell the watch. It should cover a few months in a modest studio while you find a job, a real job, where you aren't the boss's son. A job where you're the one serving people like Arthur. Richard turned to the bailiff. Officer, I've left a bag for him at the security desk with his basic identification and a few changes of clothes. Everything else stays with me. It's time he learns that a name is something you earn, not something you inherit to use as a club. Marcus began to wail, a high, thin sound of a man who had never faced a single day of true hardship. You're destroying me. You're supposed to protect me. I slammed the gavel one last time, the sound like a gunshot. Protect you from what, Mr. Sterling? From growing a backbone? From becoming a decent human being? Your father isn't destroying you. He's giving you the only thing you've ever lacked. A chance to find out who you are without a silver spoon in your mouth. I stood up, my robe swishing, the weight of the day's justice sitting heavy, but right in my chest. This court is adjourned. Get him out of here. As I stepped down from the bench, I saw Richard Sterling walk out of the back doors alone, his head held high but his shoulders heavy. He had saved his money, but he was mourning his son. And Marcus? He was left standing in the middle of the courtroom, surrounded by luxury he no longer owned, facing a world that didn't care about his last name. That was the real shock, the moment the golden boy realized that in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of his father, he was finally, completely Just another man. After the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the disgraced Marcus, the remaining spectators in the gallery let out a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. For a few seconds, there was absolute, ringing silence, followed by the inevitable low hum of stunned whispers. People were looking around in pure, unfiltered disbelief. They had just witnessed a multimillionaire legally and publicly dismantle his own son's toxic empire right in front of their eyes. I didn't bang the gavel to quiet them right away. Sometimes, a lesson that profound needs a minute to settle into the bones of a courtroom. I looked down at the docket on my bench, took a deep breath, and finally tapped the wood once, sharp and final. Order in the court. Let's move on. Next case. But the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted. The next few litigants approached the podium with a newfound, almost hyper-aware level of respect. They had seen firsthand that in my courtroom, there are no golden tickets, there are no VIP passes. There is only the truth, and the truth doesn't care about your tax bracket or your last name. Later that evening, as I was packing up my chambers, the fluorescent lights humming softly, my clerk walked in, shaking his head in disbelief. Your Honor, you wouldn't believe it. Word is already spreading outside. People in the hallway were calling it the greatest reality check they've ever seen. The sun looked completely destroyed. I just nodded, sliding my glasses off and tossing them onto the desk. It shouldn't be a shock, I replied, my voice quiet but firm. It should be the standard. But we live in a world that worships money so blindly that when a man actually chooses integrity over his own flesh and blood's entitlement, it looks like a miracle. Richard Sterling did something that 99% of wealthy parents fail to do. He stopped protecting his child from the consequences of his own terrible character. He knew that the worst thing you can give an arrogant fool is an endless safety net. And Marcus? He walked in thinking he owned the entire world, only to walk out carrying his life in a plastic security bag, entirely bankrupt in every way that actually matters. The blogs and the media would probably pick it up by morning. The headlines would scream about the Sterling heir collapse. Let them write. I didn't care about the viral drama. I cared about Arthur, a decent, hardworking man who walked out of my courtroom with his dignity fully restored and his livelihood protected. I grabbed my briefcase, took one last look at the empty courtroom, and turned off the lights. Tomorrow, the doors would open again. There would be more liars, more bullies, and more entitled people who thought they could outsmart the system. Let them come. Because whether you're wearing a bespoke designer suit or a pair of scuffed work boots, the scale of justice doesn't weigh your wallet, it weighs your character. And if you come up short in my courtroom, well, you know exactly what happens next.